There we go. Now you can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to have me at your camera club. I'm an urban explorer, and I've been doing this since 2012. It happened in a second. I was doing research for the law firm where I work. I was doing research on a late Friday evening, and I accidentally Googled the wrong search term, and a strip of images about the abandoned Glendale Asylum in Maryland popped up on my computer screen, and I became transfixed with these images. I clicked on one of the images and was taken to an urban explorer's website, and I fell down the rabbit hole until 4 a.m. And my photographic path changed in a second. I within 2 weeks, I was deep in the weeds with urban exploration, and it has been pretty good to me. As noted, I was contracted with Fawn Hill Media to write books about stateside urban exploration, and 9 are on the market now, and I'm writing 13. I'm starting my 13th book, and I think I'm going to stop at 13. I think that's enough, but who knows? You never know, because I just love exploring up and down the East Coast each weekend. Urban exploration is also known as urbex or UE, and is pretty self-explanatory. It's evolved into a community of those who like to explore and photograph abandoned man-made structures that are often off limits to the general public. Urbexers differentiate from tourists who visit ancient ruins of a distant, unfamiliar past, in that urban explorers view the beginnings of often planned contemporary decay. An urban explorer wants to document an association with the recent past and reveal a history not yet removed by demolition or nature's forces. Abandonments are therefore statements about time, nature, mortality, divestiture, and they remind us that ultimately all will be gone. I explore everything. Abandoned structures provide so many opportunities for interesting photo compositions, but this isn't for everyone. This genre is aggressive, often difficult to execute, and it's often misunderstood, especially when confronted by security personnel. This is one of the 2 photography genres, though, that gets my blood pumping, and one that will enthusiastically get out of bed at 3 a.m. and on the road for a long drive to an abandonment. I'll drive up to 6-7 hours and back on one day to explore one abandonment. As noted, I will often refer to hard urbex or soft urbex. Hard urbex is the sneak in kind of exploration where permission is not granted. I don't recommend this, but I will talk about it. And soft urbex is exploring abandoned sites with permission, and there's always access, and it's pretty easy, and you can get just as beautiful images in this mode as someone who takes the risk and does hard urbexing. This is a hospital scene. Maybe it's a pharmacy or compounding room in a hospital. I'm not quite sure. This was the first sight I saw when I entered this hospital, and seeing an abandoned setting for the first time is very dramatic. The frequent dynamic ranges of light appeal to a photographer, and there's also an emotional element involved. The sadness and the waste comes forward, and statements about our thorough society are front and center. So many sensations outside of an ordinary environment are experienced when layers of history within skeletal remains are exposed. It's a surreal experience. This is a former power plant that held endless steep metal staircases. This scene was one of the top floors, and I love the leading line, soft color and lighting. This is a farmhouse and its collection of old televisions. I found this comp this way, and to me it looks like an avant-garde art installation. Perhaps a former explorer staged it this way, I don't know. When you open the door into the silence of an abandonment, you feel the absolute emptiness of a place whose occupants have departed. It's quite a moving experience at times. This is a church, and it holds so many elements: stained glass, vibrant color, cobwebs on the pews, crumbling ceilings and supports. You see nature's hand invading the interior at the windowsill, and there's a historic cornerstone resting in the bottom left. The windows had a heavy covering of plastic on the exterior and obscured the view to the outside from the bottom half, but it allowed just enough light to filter beautifully through the stained glass. So you want to do this. There's a lot of things to consider. The structural integrity is always questionable in anything abandoned. Mistakes inside abandonments often have zero-sum consequences. You live or you die as you fall through a floor. Soft floors, especially wooden floors holding carpets of moss, are ready to break open with the slightest pressure. Concrete structures can hide rusty rebar ready to collapse with one simple step. After almost 9 years of avoiding a fall through a floor, I earned my urbex merit badge when I fell through a floor last October. Fortunately, it wasn't a long drop, and better yet, my gear was okay. I just sustained some nasty bruises and prolonged aches, so I was lucky. There are also toxic elements in abandonments: asbestos, lead paint, PCBs, rodent and animal droppings, and black mold is usually always present somewhere. You never want to run into people, though. People that hang in abandoned structures are not those you want to confront. Of course, you don't want to run into security personnel either, but I'd rather run into a security officer than someone freely hanging in an abandonment. My group often runs into other explorers inside forlorn structures, and that's okay, but it's always chilling when you hear human activity within a site. This is not an uncommon sight during my hard urbex explorations. Oftentimes, floors are collapsed from the top floor to the basement, as this section is in this abandoned mansion. I hovered at the edge of this doorway of this room to shoot this because the floor was ready to open up. You can see the holes in the floor. And there's a red and green on the floor, and that reveals a disintegrating embassy-sized rug in the dining room. It was wet and moss covered, and it covered a rotting floor that was in a state of imminent collapse. Part of the side of the house was collapsed too. As we explored this mansion, we hugged the walls and we rarely ventured into the middle of any room on the upper floors. So if you still want to do this and embark on this insanity, there are some ways to enter this arena with a good foundation. You need to master the art of low light photography, because abandonments are extremely dark, and you want this your settings to be intuitive within a forbidden environment. You don't want to waste time fumbling with your settings. You want to get in and out quickly. I dove headfirst into the hard urbex fray for the first time, and I actually had a run within minutes. But I already had a good working knowledge of dark and variable lighting photography, because at one time I shot concerts for a music magazine. And yes, I missed those gigs tremendously. There are, however, endless possibilities for soft urbexing. That's photographing sites that allow access. And these sites are just as appealing as the hard version, where access is technically forbidden. If you still want to do this at the extreme end, there are a few hard urbex rules to live by. And live is the operative word. Never, ever explore alone. Even if you're going with a group, it's still wise to tell someone outside the group where you are going and when you expect to be home. Never head to a location without research. Don't approach a large abandonment blind, as this makes you more prone to a bust or other risks. We often scout rural roads, and we find homes or farms or small structures, and we do snoop around, but I rarely go into large industrial or institutional abandonments without research. Sometimes we do enter these large complexes blind, but it isn't common, and we are quite seasoned with all of this nonsense, so we know what to expect and what to look for. Sometimes there won't be a cell signal at a location, so downloading a map for offsite viewing is a good idea. And always carry a flashlight, and have an extra one too. And always look before you step. It's just common sense stuff. And never, ever break into a place. If a door or window is open, we enter. Jumping over, crawling under, or through a crack in the fence will do fine too. Just never break anything for access, because the penalties of getting caught are not worth this risk. It's just wrong too. Don't break anything. Wear dark, comfortable clothing, cover your limbs, no shorts, and make sure your feet are properly covered. Never wear sandals. Waterproof hiking boots are the best. but steel-toe boots are even better. Parking is important. Analyze the parking situation before you get there. It goes without saying, but parking in front of a site posted with no trespassing signs is not the best strategy. You might have to walk a distance to get to a site, but always err on the side of safety and stealth. And here's some more rules. Tetanus shots are important. I've stepped on rusty nails, and one even penetrated the sole of my hiking boot. I often return home with several cuts. Urbexing is difficult and exhausting at times. Being in shape and young is a bonus. It's a big bonus, and I wish I had that young bonus. Actually, the average age is a male. An average age of an urbexer is male between 15 and 35. So I am really far removed from that Venn diagram. I'm quite long in the tooth for urbexing, but I still do it. Always make sure you enter a door and you don't let it close behind you. I often prop something up against the door if I open it. You don't want to ever be locked inside. Try to avoid touching anything as much as possible because there are lots of toxic elements inside abandonments. Avoid too much gear. Unnecessary weight will slow you down and you can't maneuver as easily and you can't run as quickly. Turn off all sound to cell phones. Obvious why this is important. And never ever take anything. This is the golden rule of urbexing. Respect the place and history of the site. It's not difficult to find abandonments. Just look around. They're often hiding in plain sight and you just overlook them. Your city, your countryside, abandoned railroad tracks often have lots of interesting stuff paralleling a rail line. Google Earth and map crawling are invaluable. You can find abandonments just by looking at the maps, especially in industrial towns that are past their manufacturing glory days. Look at the satellite view and then drop to the street view. This is a good start for research if you don't know a specific location. Even if you know a location address, always study the satellite map and then drill it down with further research. Take a drive along country roads. There are so many treasures in the rural spaces: farms, barns, homes, churches, general stores, and old gas pumps. Sometimes you can find hints of locations in urbex photographs. Street signs, names on buildings. I always jump in Photoshop and remove the name of a site or street sign so that my image is devoid of location information. And why? Because once a location is revealed, vandals descend upon it and destroy it. It's a very sad state about our culture. One time I even went so far as to blur the names off of headstones in a cemetery that sat in front of an abandoned church. Some urbexers, especially green urbexers, don't take this extra step, so you can find clues in a photograph and then proceed to the research. Instagram is a good place to find urbex collections. I always remove GPS metadata before posting. You can sometimes find it in others' metadata and even some Flickr albums. Read comments on posted photos too. You can find clues here too. Oftentimes replies to a post inadvertently drop the name of a site. If you are traveling somewhere and see a site along the road, pin it for later reference. It's best to always research. Of course, never post information for a hard urbex site, location information that is. Never post it in a public forum, and never ever ask an urbex online, where is this? Shooting. Bracketing is helpful. I used to bracket only while on a tripod, but I discovered within the past few years that bracketing while hand-holding is just as helpful. Photo editing software is so good now that there's no blur or ghosting when merging handheld images. I'll add more about bracketing in a bit. Try to have your images tell a story about life that once existed in abandoned places. Sometimes the whole story can be represented in just one image. Sometimes a collection of images is needed. This is a little story about a boarding house in a once thriving resort region. This community kitchen is ready for dinner. The china is still in the cabinet. The coffee pot is on the old cast iron stove, and there are still dishes in the sink. This house and its 1940s vibe was amazingly preserved and free from rampant vandalism. One wing of the home collapsed and some of the upper floors were on the verge of collapse, but it was a time capsule of history and revealed a quaint lifestyle that once was familiar to this region. Here's the guest bedroom of this boarding house. And I had to stand at the far right of the doorway because the floor and some of the hallway was so soft and held a carpet of thick moss and growth. You can see the holes in the floor. I was unable to get a wide shot because the floor instability was so severe, but you can see the layers of history on the wall with the varied wallpapers peeling away. And this is the dining room off the eat-in kitchen with the old work boots still sitting on the floor. This house was not level or square because some sections had already collapsed. One room in this house held a mass of old pristine vintage newspapers from the late 1800s to early 1900s. They were so fabulous and not even yellowed that much. I hope they're still sitting there in mint shape and not buried beneath a heap of collapsed roofing or vandalized by some thugs. These newspapers should be preserved in an archive. With the exception of mastering low-light photography, if you are acquainted with architectural photography, you should generally be comfortable with urbex photography. I usually meter in the matrix mode. I think it's called evaluative for Canon users, but for stained glass or window scenes, I often flip to spot metering, a trick I always use for concert photography. I don't always do this though, because we want to get in and out as quickly as possible in hard urbex situations. And I usually default to the fast track and remain on matrix metering. Bracketing often overcomes the need to switch metering modes, but then there's the extra time needed in post-processing. Of course, my optimal preference is to set my ISO at 200 and have a camera on the tripod, but this isn't a luxury when I'm hard urbexing. And I put my camera on auto ISO and let it do its thing. It often jumps to 12,800, and noise can be a problem, but it's not unbearable. And I often just spot remove noise from the images in post-processing. As noted, I don't have the luxury of taking my time with long exposures in hard urbex locations. I shoot an aperture priority when I am hard urbexing, and my preferred f-stop is f8, the sharpest point on my lens. And then I let the shutter speed adjust accordingly. I do this strictly for speed. I'm in and out quickly. Sometimes it's so dark that I have to open up and let more light in the lens, but I usually just keep it at that setting and let it rip. I shoot manual on a tripod if I don't have to look over my shoulder all the time. Some photographers often balk at my aperture mode in urbexing, but I am after the best results with minimum time during hard urbexes. You have to weigh the risks and benefits in such situations and never be tethered to photographic rules. Make the composition what you see or what you want others to see, such as this. I break the rule of thirds here, but I just love the way this window looks like watercolor on the outside with a wash of blended greens and yellows. And I love the varied vines autographing the glass. This is an old industrial fabric manufacturer that was demoed a few years ago. Focusing in dark environments is problematic. Autofocus will jump around and not lock if it can't measure the light. If you don't have an autofocus assist beam on your camera, there are some easy tricks for focusing. First, I highly recommend using an assigned back button focus. I'll never return to pressing the shutter for a focus. Back button focus is so precise, and I got the hang of it in just about an hour. To focus in dark settings, shine the flashlight on your subject and use the back button focus to set and lock it. If you have the luxury of being on a tripod, switch to manual after you lock in your focus. If you don't have a tripod, just use the locked in focus and shoot. Be careful with flashlights and abandonments. They can draw attention on the outside of seen-through windows. I was told laser pointers are useful too, although I've never used one. And some laser pointers create little images with the beam, and that's even better for setting a focus point. A laser will draw less attention too. Bracketing. I do a lot of bracketing in urbexing, especially in hard urbexing. You can set it for how many exposures you want. I go up to 9, but often only bracket 5. I rarely use more than 2 frames for a blend and usually select the darkest, especially with windows, and one of the mid-range to lighter brackets. I blend the brackets in Photoshop or Photomatics and then send them back to Lightroom for editing. I always desaturate and look at the contrast if I use photomatics. Although their presets have improved greatly in the last few years, especially photomatics as balanced photographic and natural presets. For light painting, point a flashlight or laser at the subject and set your focus. With your camera on a tripod, switch your lens to manual mode and then set for about no more than 30 seconds or bulb mode. And while the shutter is open, paint the room with the flashlight with uniform strokes, up and down and side to side. I generally use bulb mode and keep the count to less than 30 seconds because that's when noise starts to come in. Your sensor starts to heat up. You can also point a stronger flashlight at the ceiling or wall behind you and keep it steady for about 30 seconds. When the shutter closes, you check your exposure and then you adjust if you need to. You can't do much light painting and hard urbexing because I never use a tripod. I'm in and out. So this is only in soft urbex situations for me. This is a 2-blended bracket here, and I wanted to bracket this image because the scene is a symbolic study in great contrasts. This house represents the loss of a dream, but when peering out of this window, one sees someone's dream still alive and well with a beautiful house on a lovely piece of property. The sun just emerged after a brief heavy rain, and you can see the raindrops on the tree branches. The window is quite hazy and dirty on the upper half, so I was unable to grasp all of the detail and color, but I still like the symbolism of the two contrasts. And besides, the haziness of the image in the window makes the view of the so-called American dream seem like an actual dream. This is a light painted image in a basement devoid of any light. It's a shelf of endless bottles of muscatel. I guess the owner was hoarding muscatel for the apocalypse. And this is only a fraction of what was stored on a very long shelf. It's a strange thing to find inside an abandoned slaughterhouse. 3 of us were about to explore this slaughterhouse, but didn't know the owner was inside. So yes, we got caught, but the owner was so cordial and gave us a brief tour, but allowed only one of us to photograph, and I pulled the winning straw for this honor. He took us into his pitch black basement and to show us a 1930s Roadster chassis. And it was very cool, but I zeroed in on this weird collection of cheap booze. I thought this was more interesting. Capture the beauty in unforgiving environments. Natural elements are important for an urbex composition and include light beams through windows, roofs, crumbling walls, in addition to nature's green hand taking hold. Plants and interiors are always symbolic offsets to the death and decay of a man-made structure. Man-made elements show how a structure was used and the types of people who occupied it. Artifacts are always welcomed. Items left behind tell the story of the place and the history. Look for calendars, small machinery or appliances, documentations, envelopes with postage marks, clothing, and commercial goods. There is always a lonely chair in an abandonment. The place can be stripped of everything in its interior, but there is always a chair, and a chair can make for an interesting composition. There are social media groups dedicated to the concept of the lonely chair. Graffiti is a personal choice. Some love it, some hate it. I generally don't like it, but I found some interesting graffiti that complements a composition. Some of it is amusing, but most of it is harsh and defacing. Peeling paint is the gold standard for urbex photography. It's always interesting and omnipresent. Machinery is fascinating too. Rusty and sometimes ominous in appearance, it often presents a picture of America's past manufacturing glory days, and it can always put history front and center. Here's a rural church I photographed. I didn't realize that I caught a light beam until I dropped the raw image into Lightroom, and I love the twinkle of sun poking through the roof opening. I don't think the image is that interesting without the lovely sunburst. Here's a visit to a distillery, and I wish I bracketed this shot, but it was still quite a fun comp. I asked my friend to stand in the beam. It was very dark inside and brought in a bit too much noise and haze, but I still like it. This was an industrial abandonment that we found by accident. It was huge, pristine, and full of mature growth. I just loved it. One rarely finds abandoned facilities with so many artifacts left behind and absent of graffiti or vandalism. What is fascinating about this comp is that there is a 1914 capitation tax receipt on the dresser. A capitation tax is also known as a poll tax. I had to shoot this from afar because the floor was a bit too soft. I couldn't read the receipt until I dropped the image into Lightroom. Initially, I was focused on the powder puffs because they reminded me of something my grandmother used, but then the capitation tax receipt turned into the photo prize. This is a lonely chair that beautifully complements the living room bump out of a surgeon's mansion. The comp would not be as interesting without the mid-century chair. There's terrific color and lighting in this room, and unfortunately, this magnificent mansion was burned by vandals last year, so it no longer exists. Here's another lonely chair in a derelict hospital. So much texture in the chair too. It's just a study in institutional green. As I said, I'm usually not a fan of graffiti, but in this case, it was so lovely. The sun is pushing through an opening and illuminating the graffiti in the warehouse portion of a textile manufacturing plant. This illumination makes the graffiti look like stained glass, and the water reflections are so vibrant in an environment stripped of most color. Here's another example of graffiti I embrace and presents a multi-layered story. This is an impromptu historical message board courtesy of pink-slipped Cambria Steel Company workers. The terminated workers registered their comments on the brick wall as they exited the administrative office with their layoff notices and last paychecks. Cambria is in Johnstown, and I attended a meetup at this site. Johnstown is part of the Rust Belt, where economic decline, population flight, and neglect replaced a once mighty industrial manufacturing region. Here's the vibrant color and life of nature claiming dead space in a forlorn hospital. The side windows were frosted and semi-opaque, but allowed the emergence of interesting, colorful silhouettes. Nature's power is always on the mark and always at the ready to engulf the built environment. Here's one case where bracketing would have obscured the simple graffiti on the window. The peeling paint is the star, but the photographic elements such as the curvy leading staircase line and papers on the staircase complement this image. Holmesburg Prison has the best peeling paint. Colorful ribbons and sheets of paint dangled from all surfaces. The peeling paint is so dramatic in this scene that it looks like a deliberate art installation. The corridor skylights allow strong beams of light to paint some of the surfaces in vivid yellow. To me, this looks like a fantasy setting. This is a control panel that has it all: detailed textures, switches, gauges, peeling paint, and so much color. It reminds me of a giant toy or some gizmo created from a plant featured in a 1960s issue of Mechanics Illustrated. Its homemade looking appearance is too amusing and interesting to be just a staid control panel. This giant loom is spectacular, and I wish someone would remove it and place it in a museum. This loom was part of a textile manufacturer that also built a robust company town for its workers. There's so much history here and craft, and it's a shame that it might be surrendered to vandals or rot. Here's another imposing piece of machinery from the Cambria Steelworks blacksmith shop. This is a 10-ton steam-powered hammer. The color of the brick, doors, and window trim coordinates so well with the rusty giant hammer and massive hanging hook and chain. It reminds me of Garanimals styling for heavy machinery. Fortunately, this is preserved, and it will stay preserved. Stained glass is so beautiful and difficult to capture, but it is my favorite feature in abandoned churches. The photographic process is similar to shooting musicians, but easier because stained glass doesn't move. There are a few ways to grab stained glass. Using a tripod is the best, but I often do not use a tripod. A cloudy white balance often helps, and especially when using spot or center weighted metering. With spot metering, though, the areas around the glass will be dark. Another method is to matrix meter and underexpose by dialing down the exposure compensation to -1 or -2. Bracketing and merging one window shot that is overexposed and one that is underexposed is a good plan, and never use flash for stained glass. If I'm on a tripod, I often do spot metering and then switch to matrix metering to get the surrounding areas, and then I just blend the two shots. I handheld this hard urbex shot and blended two shots. I bracketed it and matrix metered, but to dial down my exposure compensation to -1. I was hard urbexing here, so I didn't have the luxury of a tripod. The interior in this church was very dark, and the stained glass windows were covered with thick plastic on the exterior, but the light came through beautifully. I especially wanted to catch the cobwebs in addition to the stained glass and door detail. I used a tripod here because I was in a workshop and did not have to look over my shoulder. The stained glass on the ceiling dome was so beautiful, and it's enormous. I spot metered on a tripod, and this is just one frame. The surrounding areas were very dark because of the spot metering, but during editing, I brushed in small amount of exposure in the surround. The dome is the star though, and I didn't want anything detracting from it, so I kept the dome frame on the dark side. The spot metering really picked up the detail on this elaborate stained glass. There are so many software suites available, and all are good. I learned digital editing in Lightroom, so that's my preference. I learned Lightroom before Photoshop. I use both, but Photoshop is primarily my surgery and blending application. Whatever you find comfortable and works with you, stay with it. I have primarily two workflows. One is using only Lightroom and Photoshop, and if some surgeries need it, such as transformation, adding canvas, or content aware. Blending images adds more steps to the workflow, but all of this is quite intuitive for me, and it's quite fast. I always have more editing to do when I hard urbex because of hand holding. I can take my time when I am in a sanctioned place and avoid many post-processing steps. What can I say about HDR? Except that it can be hideous, but it also can be quite useful for blending images. Just make editing adjustments to reduce any effects that scream HDR. Desaturate and take a good look at your contrast. Gray tones can be a problem and often are, especially with windows. If you pull the highlight slider to bring out more highlights, the white's gray. You can adjust this by pulling up the whites as you bring out more highlights, but this doesn't always allow for your preferred white. In Lightroom, if I mask an area and add highlights and it overlaps windows or anything with strong whites, I then just erase the highlights in that area. I also brush in exposure to any grayish areas during a global highlight addition. Just avoid the gray as much as possible, especially with windows. Lightroom does a good job of getting rid of chromatic aberrations, but sometimes you have to bring in the manual dropper for removal. And I don't know what's going on with the fake lens flare trend. It needs to go away. I think it's hideous. We all get lens flare at times, and most often if the sun is blowing into our lens. Sometimes you're in the wrong spot at the wrong time and can't avoid direct sun. I never use Lightroom to remove flare and just jump into Photoshop and chip away at little sections at a time. It requires patience. So what do you want to do? You won't hear me pushing for anything not sanctioned, and I think there are enough soft sites to satisfy your decay photography needs. I'm going to give you a few examples of so many soft urbex opportunities up and down the East Coast. Some are close to you, some are a little bit further away. I travel this route all the time from Virginia. There's so much available, public access, so many meetups, workshop opportunities for a multitude of abandoned structures that are accessible. I love forts. Fort Washington has several very decayed batteries off the beaten path. Fort Hancock, though, is my favorite. The entire footprint looks abandoned. Mallows Bay in Maryland has great shipwrecks and offers the best drone images. It's best to see these with a kayak, but you can see several shipwrecks along the shoreline. Just make sure you always visit during low tide. Old Town Mall in Baltimore is an outdoor retail center that has roots to the 1600s. It's several blocks of boarded merchants with some holding beautiful architectural details and ghost signs. It's fascinating, but don't go here alone. It's a rough and isolated part of Baltimore, and no one can hear you scream. National Park Seminary in Maryland looks like it's from a set of Grimm's fairy tales. There's lots of weird abandoned architecture amidst the new, and there's even a castle that is covered in vines. Penitentiaries are great for practicing urbex skills. You can find photo tours of these places, and many meetups offer photo exclusive visits. Savage Mill in Maryland is quite photogenic. There are no trespassing signs at the mill, but there are always people fishing from the mill pad and lots of groups congregating on the structure. It's easy to access, and I've never known anyone to be told to leave, so I consider that a soft site. The pile of the old Capitol East Portico stones in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., is like seeing something that should be in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's in the woods of the park, and you follow a little trail to it. There's lots of history and fascination at this spot, and it's a lovely stroll to the site. I like to go when the overgrowth is at its best, but fall is nice too. East Broadtop Railroad with its roundhouse, steam engines, and machine shop is a delight if you can hop on a workshop or meetup. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has lots of terrific workshops that Don Rosenberger hosts. I highly recommend this place. I visited twice. Waterside Woolen Mill in central Pennsylvania. There's so much to shoot here. Look for workshops and meetups. Just walking through the old steel towns or industrial towns of the Rust Belt is so visually rich. Lots of faded ghost signs on buildings and boarded up merchants, in addition to so many empty factories. And as I said, take a ride in the country and you'll see so much. Farms and barns and churches, just beautiful photogenic abandonments. Iron Soup in Ohio is a former Youngstown Steel Company town. You can contact the Iron Soup Historical Society and find out about photographer access. I went on a meetup event, so look for these too. Swannanoa Palace is amazing. Meetups are held here, and there are Swannanoa days held at the site. The best is John Plashel, the photographer, the Virginia photographer, has some workshops here, and they're not expensive. Workshops are better at than the Swannanoa days because you encounter less people, and you'll understand why this is important in a short bit. Cooper High School in Shenandoah has lots of meetups and workshops here too. The Catskill Game Farm, it's quite a hike, but it's so amazing. It's huge at 300 acres and has over 200 buildings on the site. I visited 3 times and always find it delightful. There's beautiful meandering trails in the woods and endless buildings to explore. Workshops are usually available through Abandoned America. That's Matt Christopher's company, and he hosts a lot of great workshops. They're not always cheap though. They're kind of pricey at times. The presidential heads in Williamsburg in Virginia are astonishing to shoot. If you can hop on a workshop here, I highly recommend it, but don't ever try to trespass here. It's heavily cambered at all points of entry. Again, John Plashel, the Virginia photographer, holds workshops here, and he has them in the day and evening. U.S. Steel's Carrie Blast Furnace and the nearby W.A. Young and Sons machine shop offer photo tours by the Rivers of Steel group. It's fabulous. Fonthill State, it's probably close to you, in Lancaster, is a fabulous site to explore, and the history is fascinating. It's an eclectic castle with eccentric collections inside. It's delightful if you can hop on a photo workshop. The estate offers tours as well, but I don't know if they allow photography during the tours. I went on one of John Barclay's workshops to get photo access. It was quite pricey, but it was very good. So here's some beautiful soft urbex images you can get without seeing a policeman. We found this general store along our way to a rural abandonment. We passed the structure and it turned around and grabbed the shots. It was sealed, but it was so quaint and picturesque. It has great color and texture too. So many abandonments lack color, but this one popped because of the vintage gas pumps and snaking ivy. Here's another rural find, and this site had so many detailed options for compositions. I muddied the name on the front and side signs before I posted it. The general store gas station was across from an active house, so we didn't snoop around, but we spent a good deal of time taking fabulous photos. We've never had any issues photographing exteriors of roadside sites, no matter how busy the surroundings are. Here's another perspective, great rust, peeling paint and old signs. There's a wonderful copper bell in the upper left corner of the garage, and I got a great close-up of that too. The tree is the focal point in this photo, but the red house planks make the image pop. There were turkeys on this property and they followed me around as I shot this house. I got some great close-up of colorful turkey faces. It was strange to see turkeys with such bold behavior because they're usually shy. And I guess they were guard turkeys, I don't know. Fort Washington, as I said, is terrific. Besides the giant maintained fort that everyone visits, there are abandoned batteries in the woods that surround the main fort. Some of the batteries are very difficult to access, but I was able to navigate the terrain, and I'm old. This battery, Battery Emery, is my favorite. It's easily accessible to the other, compared to the other derelict batteries at the fort, and it's actually next to a parking lot, picnic area C, as a matter of fact. Emery is large and gritty, and there are some metal gun turret assemblies scattered around. There's also a dump behind the battery that holds some special history too. Pieces of the incredibly detailed Macmillan fountain, once part of the demolished Truxton Circle in Washington, D.C. It's beautiful. Just get a map of Fort Washington. You can easily plot the trails to the abandoned batteries. It's worth a look, and the park is great for a good hike. There are beautiful Potomac River views too, and the maintained fort is spectacular and very photogenic as well. Here's Battery Emery's one of the gun emplacements. There are many. All seasons are wonderful for photography at forts. The interior of the battery is accessible too, but you need a flashlight and watch your step because the floors can be muddy and slick inside. This is Fort Hunt in Alexandria, Virginia. It's a small but lovely park. The four batteries are close to each other, and accessing them is an easy flat walk. I was cursing the sun this morning, but when I saw the starbursts in Lightroom, I got my lemonade from the sun lemon blaring into my lens. I was just very lucky to get this. As I said, Fort Hancock in Sandy Hook, New Jersey is my favorite fort. It's enormous and almost every square inch looks decayed and abandoned, and it's quite colorful. I had only an hour to photograph Hancock because I got here just before sundown and it was also a rainy day. But with speed, I was able to grab great shots, including this decommissioned Nike missile showing off on a catapult. There's a fence around this missile and you can see the fence in the rear, but I crawled up the fence just enough to hold my camera over it for an unobstructed shot. Here's a pile of mortars resting in front of a battery. It's a very strange thing to find, but a welcome find. There's so much color at this fort, as I said. This is one of the maintenance buildings at the far end of the fort footprint, and I love the vibrant door color and crawling vines. This is a subterranean battery at Fort Hancock. The mortar pit is to the left of that yellow framed door ahead, and the inner chambers behind the door are subsurface. The rails would carry the mortars to the gun emplacements. This is Swannanoa Palace. If you have an opportunity to visit it, I recommend it. It's such a beautiful mansion. The jewel of this site is this massive, pristine Tiffany window at the landing of the grand staircase. It's the image of the original owner's wife. The Tiffany window is not an easy shot to grab because it's so dark inside and the window is so bright. I recommend spot metering the window and then bracketing and matrix metering, and you should use a tripod. Sometimes the current owner holds Swannanoa days, but as I said, the best is a meetup or workshop event because there are less people battling for a spot in front of this beautiful window. John Plaschel is having some workshops here, and they're not expensive either. They're pretty reasonable. The gardens at Swannanoa are opulent too. This is the long trellis gazebo that looks over the mountain, Afton Mountain, in fact, and there are fountains, marble benches, and terrace landscaping scattered about. It's just gorgeous. Here's another view of the window from the top of the grand staircase. It has so much artistry in the ceiling dome, the marquetry of the wood floor, Doric columns, wrought iron railing, marble posts and bases, and hand-painted wall illustrations. There's so much rich architectural detail in this house, and it's all present in this one spot. This is the Swannanoa Stable House. It's a little bit of a walk down a path behind the mansion. The stable house was wide open when I was there. I don't know if it's still accessible, but it was when I visited on 2 occasions. Here's the interior of the stable house, and there's a lonely chair coordinating so well with the structural crumbling. The horse stall section has beautiful light. Another fabulous photo site is East Broad Top Railroad. I visited a few times with my meetup, and it's a feast for photography. The railroad began operations in 1881 and closed in 1956, but still holds everything beautifully preserved in the roundhouse, train station, and machine shop. This is one of the oldest roundhouses in the United States, and it houses 6 vintage steam locomotives dating to 1911. East Broad Top is attempting to ready some steam locomotives for short tourist trips. So I'm not sure what their status is for allowing photo groups in the future, but if you see any opportunities to visit it, I highly recommend it. It's in central Pennsylvania. Here's a collection from the East Broad Top machine shop. East Broad Top served coal hauls for the region, and when coal lost its luster, so did the railroad. It's a wonderful site. It's huge. Penitentiaries and states of arrested decay are just wonderful for UE photography. This is an upper level Eastern State Penitentiary cell block. You can buy a tripod permit at ESP for $10 along with the admission fee. There are often several workshops and meetups that provide special photo access, but if you go during regular admission times, make sure you get there when the doors open, as it gets quite crowded at times. It's quite a popular tourist site. This is Ohio State Reformatory, a huge prison that has the largest freestanding cell block in the world. It's also known as the Shawshank Prison, the set of that movie. The right image is part of the prison chapel, and you can get special photo access here with some workshops. I contacted the prison directly to get special access an hour before the site opened and was allowed to photograph spaces not open to tourists. Here's a good hint. For good photo opportunities, go at a good time. I went on a Monday during the first week in April, and I was the only one with special photo access. After my special photo access, I encountered only 5 tourists throughout the prison in 5 hours. This place is quite large, but can get very crowded at sometimes during the year. And sometimes they have special photo access events, and they can get very crowded too. So try to work something out on your own if you want to go there. I just emailed them. That's all I did. This is one of my favorite Ohio Reformatory images. The X is light from the 4 rooms, and I quickly set up my tripod to grab it before the clouds obscured it. The color and textures pop too. I wasn't aware that I captured a light burst from the light until I loaded the raw image into my Lightroom. The staircase leads to the chapel. Holmesburg Prison is spectacular. It's in Philadelphia. I was able to acquire special access via one workshop and one from the Philadelphia Bureau of Prisons. A few years ago, though, the Prison Bureau shut down any photo group access, and I doubt they will reinstate it at any time in the near future. They won't respond to any inquiries either, but you can always hope they bring it back. I love this prison. It's like a smaller version of ESP, but it's grittier. This image presents the central core for cell block access, and that dome is a prop from a 1990s movie filmed shortly after Holmesburg closed. The dome presents a haunted composition, though. It looks like a dystopian Mad Max vision. Holmesburg has daunting prison doors. I don't think anyone can pick this lock. It's just very bold and fierce looking. The dirt is thick, and Holmesburg rules with its bold peeling paint. There are flags of paint hanging from all surfaces. Here's a look down a Holmesburg cell block, and if this doesn't look medieval, I don't know what does. There's so much metal and peeling paint. It looks like a tunnel of terror. And the cell on the right was once a padded cell, and the pads have since detached from the walls, but it has so much lovely natural light. Lake Shawnee in West Virginia, this holds history dating to the first settlements in 1600s, well before the concept of the United States. This site is legendary for its strange occurrences and tragic deaths. The site holds this Ferris wheel, a swing ride, some outbuildings, old vehicles, and an entertainment pavilion. It's best to visit this site in mid-late fall or early spring. You have to do this before the massive growth takes hold of the structures, because once the summer is in full force, the entire Ferris wheel is covered in vines. I visited in the fall and first week in November actually, and enough of the vines died off to allow the emergence of the Ferris wheel bones, but held enough vines to add interest. In the summer, the structure is just covered with growth. The owner has Lake Shawnee days at this site, usually in fall around Halloween. If you're ever down in this area and if the owner is on site, he often lets people on site if there are 3 or more in a group, and he'll give a tour and history of the place for a small fee. It's a long drive for just a few things, but I did it on my own. Old vehicles are always great to shoot, and there are so many options for close-up shots too. These shots are always popular with viewers. The old dilapidated building behind this old Mack truck is a good frame anchor for this colorful truck. This was taken at the truck farm in Columbia, Virginia. This was inside the truck farm garage in Columbia, Virginia, and it held some old vintage vehicles. Those dots of light are bullet holes in the metal garage walls, and I just love the bokeh effect. It looks like a string of party lights. This is Sweet Springs Sanitarium in West Virginia. I visited this site about 2 months ago, and it holds history to the late 1700s. It was once a resort, then a tuberculosis sanitarium, a rehab center, and it closed in the 90s. A new owner has grand plans for it, but to me the plans seem like an overwhelming feat, as well as being in the middle of a very rural part of West Virginia. It's a long climb upward for the new owner, but bless his ambitious heart. My favorite part of Sweet Springs, though, is this area, the hot springs. I'm shooting from the bathhouse, and this structure was the entrance to the hot springs. I put my hand in the water, and it was very warm and clear with lovely ferns rooting in the spring. I love windows. I'm always drawn to windows in abandoned sites, and thought this looked like stained glass along with the reflections streaming on the hospital tile. The pebbled glass allowed the silhouettes of the vines to diffuse, but still allow the colors of the exterior to come through. The right is a large Sweet Springs commercial kitchen with all its equipment intact. It's a huge institution. There are several abandoned homes on the Sweet Springs site, and some are large, appearing to be boarding or apartment structures. The owner let us have a free run into the homes, and I was quite surprised because some of these are not structurally sound, such as the one on the left. The people in the workshop that weren't urban explorers per se avoided the homes, but not us hardcores. We dove right in. Sweet Springs has one of the most pristine laundry areas I ever saw in a large institution. It's so fabulous, and there's so much awesome equipment in their laundry room and their boiler room and their kitchen. It's a great place to explore. This is the Presidential Head Collection in Croker, Williamsburg, and it's astonishing to see. The scale is front and center with the concrete monuments at 20 feet high, and you can compare this with the 2 people in the left foreground. And of course, we were gifted with a great sunset. I joined John Plashel's workshop for the evening event. I attended one of his evening sessions, and this is approaching sunset. And here is Lincoln, and he even has his very own Lincoln log. It was much darker than it appears in this image. My ISO is really hiked. I took my camera off of a tripod because I was rushing around getting peopleless images before darkness. The artistry detail is phenomenal on these structures. After sunset, we spun some steel wool at Blue Hour. I hardly do this process because it's so dangerous. It's dangerous to brittle abandonments, but here there is only stone, dirt, and wet ground from the recent rain, and the owner sanctioned it, so we did it. To spin wool, you need a dog leash, a large kitchen whisk, some steel wool, and a 9-volt battery. You stuff the steel wool in the whisk, attach the whisk to the dog leash, and touch the 9-volt battery to the wool, and it will ignite. You start spinning wildly over your head, and pieces of the steel wool break off and fall like fireworks. If you are the spinner, make sure you're covered, especially hands, head, and hair, and you always wear goggles. You need to be on a tripod to capture the flow. Here I am exposing for 13 seconds. This is the Variety Theater in Cleveland, Ohio. I attended one of Matt Christopher's workshops here. It's a magnificent palace design theater that is getting a second chance at restoration. I enjoyed this workshop because it's filled with some fun facts. Toward the end of its life, Variety used the site as a concert venue. Motorhead was Variety's last performance and also sealed the closing fate of this theater. Motorhead's performance was so loud that pieces of the ceiling and plaster rained on the concert attendees, and it was so loud that people living in the neighborhood recorded the performance from inside their homes. Multiple legal complaints about the noise and nuisances ensued, and the courts ordered Variety to shutter. It was dark for decades until a group formed to build support and restoration efforts for the Variety Theater. Here's the balcony area of the theater. It's such a gorgeous palace-style theater. And the ornate Variety lobby, beautiful detail on the ceiling and a popping red chandelier. Phillipsburg Pump House in New Jersey. I visited twice, once with the meetup and once with the workshop. This site is also a depository for old New Jersey transportation memorabilia, old signs, signal pole switching arms, lights. The left image features the massive 51-foot tall vertical triple expansion water pump built in 1913. The right image shows the great amount of transportation memorabilia in this facility. The pump is located through that double green door. There's a lot to see at this site, inside and outside. They have a lot of old vehicles on the property too. This is a handheld pump house shot, and I had to do it at a high ISO. I couldn't squeeze a tripod in here, so I handheld it. Stumbling upon this pile of stone is, like I said, is like a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, like a lost civilization. It's massive in tall layers of mossy stones crowned with greens, and they're piled in the woods of Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. These are the historic remnants of the dismantled Capitol building, East Portico. It was dismantled in 1958. The portico stone pieces are like puzzle pieces, and the portico could be reconstructed according to the chiseled stone identifiers such as these. The left look like vases, but unfortunately when I visited this spot last fall, it appeared that these pieces were pinched. I couldn't find them anywhere, and it's so wrong if someone took them. The columns of the dismantled East Portico, though, stand proudly in the National Arboretum. This magnificent color is courtesy of fall. I shot this during the first week of October. The removed East Portico columns were once rotting in wood crates on a swampy piece of government piece of property, but a women's group lobbied to have the columns safe from obscurity, and the columns found their new home in the National Arboretum. It's my favorite part of the Arboretum. Here's a late summer image. The meadow holds brown grass from a summer drought, but it's still lovely. The columns are beautiful at any time of the year. This is a ghost village of Union Level. It's a small derelict commercial strip, more than what's seen here, and was once a building site of mercantilism courtesy of the railroad that once passed through this community. There's another ghost village about an hour away in Purdy and Pamplin, also on the verge of ghost status, which is about an hour away from this site. Here's a historic church on a very rural Southern Virginia road that we found a few months ago. It's a beauty. Keep your eyes open and look in all environments, rural and urban. Abandonments are often hidden in plain sight. Now here's the down and dirty stuff. I won't be revealing any locations, just generalities, unless sites have been demoed. Having said that, I have ventured into some crazy sites and I've had some crazy hair-raising experiences and some injuries too. This activity isn't for everyone. Make sure it's something you want to do if you pick go. This China factory was just superb. So much to see and shoot. It's an enormous footprint, and even with a good part of it already burned to the ground. I had to pick up my jaw from the ground when I walked inside this, and this was the first scene I saw. It's fairly easy to access, but it's attached to an active facility, so one has to be quiet. Here's another great view of the factory with the shipping crate of cups cascading from it. There's so much to shoot at this site. Offices with old furniture, sections with endless shallow trays of china decals, machinery, kilns, symmetrical columns, and lots of great windows and natural light. This strange structure is the ceramic production area, and I love the green invasion. The old china molds sitting amidst the greens are great too, and the blue cast on the dirty windows. It was raining when we visited the china factory, so I took advantage of a hole in the roof, and with the waterfall flowing from it, I handheld this with the high ISO, but I liked the way it turned out. I visited this rural home with my friend, and it was wide open. This living room had only 3 working walls. One was blown out. There are so many artifacts in this house, and this is the house that included the capitation tax receipt that I posted earlier. I like this still life in the corner of the kitchen of this house. An abandoned house with an abandoned house. Irony. There wasn't much in this house, but this was the prize, and we drove more than 3 hours to grab the image of this prize. It's beautiful natural lighting. I like this composition, and this is how I found it in this house. The colors and lighting are wonderful, although it was quite dark inside. This house was a treasure trove of artifacts. It's always sad to see so many family photos, letters, and personal artifacts as cast-offs. I always wonder why there doesn't seem to be any family members wanting these memories. Homes always rip out my heart when I explore them. They're not my favorite. The attic of a filled house. Some nature forced its way inside, but other vines are shut out and plastered against the window in hope of entry. There were so many old photos and books scattered about, and this old organ is special too. The living room is complete with portraits, family samplers, a sewing box, a crochet throw, reading glasses on the table next to the phone. At one time, this room must have been warm and cozy, filled with family and pets. Compositions like this are difficult to view, especially with such personal possessions so front and center. Everyone wants to be remembered, and that is why I never understand such scenes like this. These images should boldly show the sadness of the forgotten life. This is a magnificent manor house. I would have preferred to take my time to manage this composition better, but because the site is so exposed and monitored, it was raining, it was risky to be here, so I couldn't dawdle. A grab and go shot it was. The property is for sale, and it holds such illustrious history. I hope it receives the restoration it deserves because the architecture is remarkable. I fear, though, that it might be razed with another cookie-cutter housing development taking its place. I love this gorgeous greenhouse attached to this mansion. It's my favorite part of this grand lady. It's double-tiered, and its design is so appealing and inviting. I can imagine how grand it was in its heyday with plants cultivated to beautify the interior of this mansion. Many of the manor house bedrooms look like this. Another was blue, and others were pink and yellow. Most had sitting rooms like this one. All had ornate fireplaces and beautiful woodwork. Nice color throughout, even though it lacked artifacts. A historic machine shop that evolved into a facility that manufactured large metal presses. It's been abandoned for more than 50 years. I love the way nature claimed the interior, and the gantry crane looms like an ominous sentry above the factory footprint. There was much color in this industrial site, courtesy of Mother Nature. It has colorful glass and lots of graffiti. This factory was easy to access, real easy. This is one of my favorite photo collections, and also one of the riskiest and definitely one of the most difficult. This is a former tuberculosis hospital, and entry is very high risk because the front is cameraed and there is an active secured facility next to it. And there's much activity in the front parking lot because utility vehicles park there when not in use. And if caught inside, the state does not take too kindly to the invasion. Normally, I wouldn't consider such high risk sites, as it isn't worth it to me at this point after so many years of doing this insanity. But it was my friend's birthday, and this is what she wanted to do. So off I went and joined along with the crazy groupthink mentality. We took a long path through the woods behind the hospital and had to plow through an endless path of 3 to 5 foot sticker bushes, crawl over boulders and lots of uneven terrain. But we still had to encounter one last obstacle, a very steep, muddy slope, and it required more crazy navigation. My 2 friends went first, and by the time it was my turn, the steep slope turned into a slick, muddy slip and slide. I was almost to the top and started sliding. Somehow I got turned around, landed on my back, but was able to catch a tree branch with one hand. I was hanging to this branch and tried to turn around and pull myself up, but it was all for naught because I couldn't get a footing. I threw my camera bag to my pals and kept pounding my heel into the mud for a footing wedge, and eventually was able to pull myself up. But my backside from head to toe was a heavy strip of mud and stayed that way until I got home. The ordeal was worth it though, because I love the many green verandas. Nature has run amok here and I just love it. Here's another veranda that served tuberculosis patients. Patients would sit here taking fresh air as they looked over a lovely fertile valley. On one of the end rooms on the second floor, with nature still making its presence everywhere, great windows and vines. The state removed the staircases from this hospital because I guess they wanted to keep people like us out of it. So to get to the upper level, a metal headboard was propped against a wall for climbing to the second floor. It was very dark in parts, including the area that required a climb on the metal headboard, which I did not know this was what it was until the drive home and my friend informed me of this. So crazy as it's crazy does. Here's another view of the open door and old hospital bed frames propped against the wall. An old medical book sits amidst the hills and valleys of dirt and dust. The natural light is so beautiful in this place. The dust and debris falling off the walls, collected in the halls, and some hallways look like long rows of sand dunes. Here's a power plant that is now being demolished. This is the control room circle. My friend wanted to visit it, and I said I would only go on one condition only, that we arrive at 6 a.m. because the site is situated on a very busy highway. There are endless comps inside, and it was also horrendously hot on this July day, mid-90s and humidity, and there were steep metal staircases everywhere, lots and lots of them. It was a difficult explore. I had to crawl through a crack in a fence and then under an opening in a garage that was about 10 inches. I tore my clothes doing this, but I got inside. Another heavy industrial shop, but that muck in the pool at the base of that giant metal contraption doesn't look too inviting. A shot through a window. I just love windows. I can ID this place because it was demoed last year. This is the former industrial giant of Baltimore, PEMCO, the industrial ceramics manufacturer. It was established in 1911. And PEMCO commanded a huge footprint of buildings that ceased operations in 2006. The site was easy to access, even though it was across from a police station. This is a room holding pallets of cryolite powder used in metallurgy for the manufacture of enamel products, but my focus is on the lovely natural green drapes on the windows. And there are those windows again. The long PEMCO stop sign corridor, lots of graffiti and color. This is another power plant with its magnificent turbine hall and a site I visited just a month ago. It was a harrowing exploration. Getting to it required a difficult trek to the side along a rocky, watery coast. The rocks were covered with moss and quite slippery. I asked the guys I was with if they pre-checked the tide charts as we called across the rock, and they said, no, that's just great because we might not be able to get back with high tide. And yes, we did have a hard time getting back when high tide started to roll in. There was a fence along the property, but part of the fence fell and we had to walk across the fallen fence. It wasn't easy. Then we had to push through dense foliage again, and including more blasted sticker bushes, and finally climb down a steep grade. To get in required crawling, commando style, under a metal flap at the bottom of a metal door. But as I ran across the driveway towards the entry point, I tripped on a fallen tree branch and did a face plant on the cement. I broke my nose very badly, and I still have bruising on my face, but trialed on the concealer for this event. My nose is not in good shape for about another 3 to 6 months. But these are the hazards of hard urbexy and why I don't ever recommend it. And this is a study in symmetry and shadows above the turbine hall. After I broke my nose, I immediately went inside and explored for more than 4 hours. My nose was like a volcano, and I left a red trail towards the entrance for future explorers' benefit, as well as I left lots of red inside too. They'll probably wonder what's going on if they ever go inside that place. Getting to the site required 7 hours in the car, and I wasn't going to give it up for a broken nose. Needless to say, I was a frightful mess by the end of the day. Here's a colorful window in a very dark section of the power plant. It was very dark in many parts, and I needed a flashlight for some parts. But there were parts that had electricity with lights on. Some machines were buzzing and phones were beeping on each level. This activity just freaked me out and my stress level was off the charts. I was quite nervous and honestly couldn't wait to leave, but I'm glad I went. The place was massive. It's a decommissioned coal-fired plant. There were such interesting silhouettes and symmetry and leading lines in this power plant. I could have spent 10 hours inside, but the longer one stays inside an unearthed site, the odds of getting caught are greater. We found the control room, but it was fully illuminated and it appeared to have dynamic activity inside with computers and LEDs that were still illuminated and rolling. So we didn't go into the room, and I would refuse to go into that room. But we found out later that other explorers, only 2 actually, because it's hard to get into this site, got into the control room and didn't trigger anything. So the room is active, but it's not. But by the time we found that, my nerves were shot, and I had had enough. 5 hours after I fell, I finally got ice on my nose, but it was a little too late for this. But I got great images. I guess I really earned my hardcore urbex badge this year. I can reveal this site too because it was demolished and is just now a rolling meadow in Patapsco State Park. This was Henryton Tuberculosis Sanitarium in Marriottsville, and it was a massive campus. Some of the buildings were beautiful. The complex is historic too because when it opened, it was a state-of-the-art African-American tuberculosis sanitarium. But just as the scourge of tuberculosis drove the birth of the Henryton facility, Henryton evolved into a local scourge during its almost 3 decades of abandonment. The Maryland government faced ever-present on-site drug problems, vandalism, and especially arson. Because utilities were shut off, there was no access to water to extinguish arsonist fires since the hospital sat in the middle of a state park. The site was difficult to monitor, but that also made it easy to explore and access. But despite pressure from the preservationists, the Maryland government finally threw up its hands, circular filed any plans for repurposing the historical site, and raised Henryton after the last big fire in 2013. This is a typical Henryton hallway. Part of the roof is missing, and there were gaping holes in the flooring. Asbestos was everywhere. The other image is a window view from a building at the high end of the terrain. The campus was not flat, and the many buildings were terraced with lovely snaking drive to the various buildings. This is a rural diner, very quaint and well preserved, with lots of old-fashioned artifacts, including menus and an old adding machine. A very pristine 50s-looking diner. I just want someone to rescue it. This was an interesting site and a very fortuitous encounter. We were on our way home from a long day of exploration in Western Pennsylvania and wanted to shoot this charming 1875 abandoned covered bridge as our last stop. We knew the bridge was on private farm property, so we parked on the highway and walked to it, thinking we could quietly sneak in and shoot and go. But when we arrived, all at once, a drove of happy piglets started running towards us. They were like happy Walmart greeters. The piglets made lots of noise, and the mom and papa pigs weren't happy about their piglets being so social. So we started shooting the bridge, and I was at the far end when I saw my friends walking towards a man at the other end. The man my friends walked to was the farmer that owned the property, so yes, we got caught again. But he was friendly and just warned us to stay away from the cranky adult pigs because they can snap on a whim. But you see you can see the century-old graffiti on the bridge truss on the left, but there is also a building ahead, and that's an abandoned grist mill, one built in the twilight phase of the first industrial revolution in 1852, and it closed in 1932. The farmer owned this giant mill too, and my friend managed to charm him into letting us inside. It was almost sundown, so we had less than an hour of light. The farmer went to his house, returned with a giant skeleton key, and we couldn't believe our good fortune. What we saw inside was an incredible collection of artifacts and machinery, undisturbed for nearly 90 years. It was quite large too, at 4 levels. There is so much old Americana inside this grist mill. I found these 3 early 1900 photography books and a pile of Kennedy moth-proof garment bags, Such a great find, but 40 minutes wasn't enough. Yet we were so lucky to have this time, and we saw things that no one will see. See how open my lens was? F4 and a high ISO. It was very dark inside. So many vintage commercial posters were inside this grist mill, cast iron stoves and all the original 19th century machinery. The stone grinding wheel was still there, as were the old wooden gears and leather pulleys. The farmer inherited the property from his father and his father from his father. It was quite an adventure and time travel to be inside this mill, but we lost light too soon and had to leave. Greenhouse facilities are always interesting to shoot, lots of textures and glass with leftover greens growing with abandon. This old greenhouse was attached to an abandoned asylum. Oftentimes, large medical institutions were self-sufficient and had farms and greenhouses for their own food production. This is one such hothouse that once served the food needs of the former hospital. I found this strange collection in a very large government greenhouse facility. There was an administrative warehouse type building at the far end of the large greenhouse complex, and it was obvious someone lived here. But there was so much disturbing writing on the walls. Someone was very angry, and based on what I was reading on the walls, I told my friends I didn't want to run into this person as we explored. I walked into one of the smaller buildings and turned a corner and saw this and gasped a little bit. It made me jump a little, but I love it. Perhaps the occupant left this collection as a warning for everyone to leave immediately. I love to shoot abandoned churches, especially those with vaulted ceilings and stained glass. This church was quite beautiful, and I walked up to the choir loft to get an expansive view. The problem, though, was that as I walked toward the front of the choir loft, the whole structure started to crack and dip, so I quickly moved back and shot it further back for safety measures. I'm not a fan of graffiti, but I find this artistry a nice contrast for what would be a blank wall behind the altar. This church opened in 1899 and closed in 2002 when the steel industry greatly retracted and causing a mass population flight from the community, along with diminishing numbers of parishioners. It's a shame it has to come to this. The carved pews of this church held the names of some parishioners. It was quite a blow to the community when this church closed, as multi-generations of families were bonded to this site. And when big steel entered the region in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the church was an extension of family, and it's quite destroyed now. There's no semblance of pews, windows, or chandeliers now. I took a look inside last year after photographing this 2 years prior, and everything was destroyed by vandals. It's just heartbreaking. This was a magnificent religious institution and technically not a church. It was very difficult to access. It was quite beautiful and pristine inside. We heard activity in a structure attached to the church, so I moved away from this area because my shutter is so loud. The site reminded me of the cathedrals in Europe with its thick stone walls, heavy leaded stained glass, arched windows and doorways everywhere, carved gold, wood, so much opulent detail everywhere, even the obscure hallways and basement. I do regret not bracketing my shots. I wish I would have done that. Here's a view from a side hallway, beautiful carved arched doors. The windows are a bit blown out, and again, I regret not bracketing for this purpose. The second image is an opening to a far hallway, and even the window in the rear holds interesting design features. Schools are great for UE photography, and especially if they are recently closed and not vandalized. This Votech High School was loaded with good stuff. It was an enormous facility. This is one of their very interesting science labs. It was difficult to get into this site, and I performed some crazy gymnastics that should not be a consideration for someone my age. It was another pain is good for the soul day for me. Here's a different school's library and the sad state of its book collection. This photo disturbs a lot of my social media followers. No one likes to see books unceremoniously strewn about, but this scene took this action to a new level. An old rural school in the woods and its lovely old auditorium. I removed the school name from the top of the stage curtain. This was a small but charming old school in very good shape and devoid of senseless vandalism. Here's, I love the natural light of the book on the bookcase in this school, and I just love this bookcase. This place made me shriek with laughter. It's a honeymoon hotel along a congested 6-lane highway. It's not in the Poconos and it doesn't have beautiful views of woods or waterfalls. Instead, it has a view of the Wawa across the street. Each room had its own love theme and there were mirrors everywhere. Of course, this is the heart room and it's so awful. Electrical hazards are everywhere too. There's a 2-person tub behind that bed and without ground fault interrupters anywhere. I imagine water splashed on the bed too. It was so tacky. The whole place was tacky. Here's another theme room. I think it's supposed to be an aquarium. And there's police tape on the bed too, and I wonder why. At least the mermaid featured on the wall is not a voyeur with her body turned away. Here's another honeymoon site, and you can tell this is in the Poconos, and it's very trashed. It's quite massive too, with acres and acres of buildings. The wedding bell-shaped pool holds a red heart-shaped tub slightly peeking above the water line in the one right corner. Here's a heart-shaped tub that either willfully removed itself from its tacky interior decor or someone was crazy enough to drag it from one of the rooms. This was a fun site to explore, but some of the cottages on stilts on the slope property were not safe. They were ready to topple over. Plus, the rooms were so trashed and broken, mirrors were everywhere. There were carpets made of mirror pieces. I found a few rooms with heart-shaped tubs, and some still had the round beds with mirrored ceilings intact, but so many heart-shaped tubs were missing. So where did they all go? Did people take them home? It's very strange. It was easy to squeeze through the fence, but 2 days after our visit, there was a massive fire on the property. Obviously arson and the way of many abandonments. Well, I guess love is dead. And I guess I will end my presentation on this note and take your questions in a bit. But lastly, I have 9 published books about my adventures in urban exploration. I'm contracted with Fonthill Media, a London-based publisher. 4 additional titles will be released in 2021 and early 2022. I'm stopping at 13. Fonthill contacted me in early 2017 and asked if I would be interested in writing books about state-based urbex sites. And they discovered my photos online after doing urbex photo searches. There are quite a few other urbex authors out there now, but I was one of the first, not the first, but maybe the second or third. I was going to stop at 8 books, but COVID quarantine started and I needed something to do since all of my photo events were canceled. So I signed for 5 more books. I've been cranking out a book every 3 months since 2017, and I enjoy the process. But Fonthill became a little cranky this year with the COVID impact, but really who hasn't been cranky this year with the COVID impact? But I'm still pretty sure I'm finishing after 13. I'm writing my 13th and last book now. It's about Salton Sea, one of my favorite urbex places in the United States. The other 3 were submitted and awaiting release. Eastern PA will drop in November. I submitted Eastern Pennsylvania 2 years ago, and it's also the region I grew up in, so I'm a bit put off that the publisher sat on this release for so long, but it's finally coming. My website holds my urbex gallery, including photo galleries of my non-urbex collections, landscape, nature, people, concerts, lots of things, destinations, Cuba, Kenya, Galapagos. It's an easy address. My website is simply cindyvasko.com. And now I'm ready for questions. So I will stop my share.